Why did the church break away from Judaism? Why did a small group of followers of a first century rabbi start a new religion that was different from his? This fall, as a new biblical year begins, First Fruits of Zion's Torah Club small group Bible study program embarks on a new journey. It's called The Sent Ones, Acts of the Jewish Apostles, and it's going to take us through the book of Acts and beyond, exploring and explaining the great divorce between Judaism and Christianity. Our guest today, First Fruits of Zion's Director of Education, D. Thomas Lancaster, is here to walk us through what this Bible study is about and why this knowledge is so critical for us today.
Put your hand in mine together. We will walk in harmony. Let me introduce you to my teacher, the rabbi from the Galilee.
You're listening to Messiah Podcast, where Jesus is Jewish and that changes everything. Messiah Podcast is a production of First Fruits of Zion. Welcome back to Messiah Podcast. First Fruits of Zion Director of Education, D. Thomas Lancaster.
Hey, it's great to be here again with you, Jacob. Long time no see. Not really. Well, we just got out of a Zoom meeting about an hour ago, I suppose. But here we are again.
And even in real life, I popped up for Shavuot.
That was great
year.
to have you here. Great to have you here. That was a lot of fun. You should make that a habit.
I would love to. You know, it's only about what was it, like a 6 or 7 or 8 hour drive? It really depends on Chicago. Driving through Chicago is a crapshoot. It can take an hour. It can take 2 hours.
Yeah, you never know. You never know what's going to happen there. So get yourself a good audiobook and,
That's a good idea. Then I can make it a learning experience. So today we're going to talk about Torah Club. We're going to talk real specifically and granularly about the content of Torah Club. But Torah Club, it may not be obvious to a first-time listener, and we always try to be aware of the first-time listener here on Messiah Podcast. It may not be obvious what we're talking about when we talk about Torah Club. So I thought to start the conversation, can you tell the uninitiated among us, what is Torah Club?
Sure. Torah Club it's a Bible study. That's the easiest way to put it. It's a Bible study, and it's a small group Bible studies all over the country, not only all over the country, all over North America, but not only all over North America, but really internationally as well. We have Torah clubs in places like Korea, Indonesia, Germany, England. We have Torah clubs in Israel. And there's Torah clubs in Jerusalem. And what are the Torah clubs? Studying these Bible studies, these people coming together to study the Word of God. That's essentially what we're talking about. But you're studying the Bible from a Messianic Jewish perspective. And so you get these lesson books. We provide these videos. You have a group leader who leads you through a discussion about the weekly lesson. And the weekly lessons might be based on the synagogue Torah portions that are read in the synagogue that particular week. Or sometimes we venture into the New Testament and start exploring some New Testament territory. And that's what we're doing this year in Torah Club, which I'm very excited about. We're going into the book of Acts of the Apostles and beyond.
Nice.
Kind of like to infinity and beyond. It's to Acts of the Apostles and beyond.
Yeah. So it's the official title of our study track this year. And I say, it's next year, but it's next year on the biblical calendar, so next year starts in October,
right?
As of this recording of year 5785, and we're going through. And the official title is "The Sent Ones: Acts of the Jewish Apostles."
That's it. Yep. Acts of the Jewish Apostles, the Sent Ones, Acts of the Jewish Apostles. That's the title. Yep.
The answer to this question may be contained in the title. But I think it's worth asking, what is an apostle? That's something that I didn't know growing up, is that apostle was a technical term. Like maybe it should have a capital A or something. I don't know, but it means something. It's not just something. I couldn't go out tomorrow and say I decided to be an apostle, right? It's a special kind of identity. What is it? What is an apostle?
You're right. And that's where we get the title, the sent ones. To be an apostle is to be a sent one. And it is possible you could go out and, I could send you somewhere and then you'd be a sent one, right? And so in a sense, you'd be an apostle. The Greek word apostolos means sent one. And likewise, that's from the Hebrew shaliach, it's translating the Hebrew shaliach, which means sent one. So anybody who's a sent one in some measure could be considered to be an apostle, but not an apostle of Yeshua the Messiah.
Right.
So this is where we get into the specific criteria. To qualify for that title, to be a sent one of Yeshua the Messiah, you have to be sent specifically by Yeshua the Messiah. And this happened during the 40 days between his resurrection and his ascension. There's this period of time that's described in the beginning of the book of Acts, and we get we see glimpses of it at the end of each of the Gospels as well. This period of time where he designates his sent ones that he's sending out to witness regarding his resurrection and to bear testimony and to transmit his teaching. And so these are specific individuals, specific sent ones, specifically sent on this particular mission. So no, unless you were one of those to whom he appeared during the 40 days after his resurrection and designated as someone he is sending out, you can't be an apostle. So there's been no apostles, no capital A apostles, as you put it, since the first century.
Now, there was one guy who came along a little late. I think there's one exception, right?
Right.
Who was not during the 40 days.
But it's very interesting. So everybody, of course, the apostle, the most famous apostle is the Apostle Paul, and the Apostle Paul did not have that experience of seeing the resurrected Yeshua during the 40 days. Instead, the Master appeared to him sometime later on the road to Damascus, as we read in Acts 9, and the Master appears to him and designates him as an apostle through that vision, actually through a series of encounters with Yeshua that he has. He's also designated as an apostle, but he's being sent specifically to the nations. And because of that, because of this strange situation where it's more visionary, we find in Corinthians, him having to defend his work as an apostle and his title as an apostle, because that's not normal. That's not how it's supposed to be. And so in 1 Corinthians 15, for example, he even gives that caveat. He says, last of all, to me, even though I'm not worthy to be counted as an apostle, but I am as an apostle, he says, as one untimely born. So, in other words, he's comparing himself to a child that wasn't born at the proper moment of gestation, at completion of gestation. So maybe like a C-section or a child that's overdue, way overdue, but premature. However, we're understanding that metaphor. The point is, Paul himself is saying, hey, this is not normal for an apostle. My situation is an exception to the rule. So what's the rule? The rule is that Yeshua appeared to these apostles during those 40 days.
Yeah, and that's one of those things that I definitely missed growing up in the church, growing up with, homeschool Christian curriculum even. It's to realize that Paul is the weird one. Paul's the most famous one, but he is not the typical case of an apostle.
Right.
It's definitely normal that we as Gentiles would gravitate toward him because he is the apostle to us. But somewhere there needs to be the realization that Paul is different from all the other apostles in this critical way, and he was aware of that, and so were they.
Yes, and it's natural, like you said, because he's the apostle to the nations, the apostle to the Gentiles, that we should gravitate towards him. But it's also the fact that he had Luke with him, who wrote the book of Acts, and wrote the book of Acts as an apologetic for his particular ministry to the Gentiles. And so we have a very Paul-centric view of the apostolic era and the work of the apostles, because Luke was specifically setting out to write the story of Paul. So he pretty much ignores and doesn't necessarily know the lives of the other apostles, which are happening concurrently as he's traveling around with Paul. So we're missing a great deal of information in that regard. And then the other thing that brings Paul into the spotlight, of course, is the Pauline scriptures, his epistles, that we have that collection. We don't have a great library of epistles from the other apostles, unfortunately, because those probably would have been Semitic. Those probably would have been more Aramaic sources and Hebrew sources. Paul gives us this wealth of Greek text, and Greek being the lingua franca. And so we have this someone in the Pauline school gathered up Paul's epistles and collected them and for posterity. That might have happened with the other apostles as well, but if so, those were lost along with those communities of Jewish believers that disappeared from view after the Bar Kokhba revolt.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe Brad Young is right, and we'll find a treasure trove of that kind of stuff. Wouldn't that be great?
That would turn everything upside down. That would be amazing.
I think you mentioned that Luke set out really to talk about Paul, which is true. And I think maybe this is just like survivorship bias, like you said, that these are the texts that we have. But I think a lot of people read some theology into that Acts starts out in Jerusalem, and it starts out with Peter sort of out in front. And then as you go through, really, it almost looks like the baton's being handed off. And a lot of Christians that come out of this reading Acts with this idea that the Jewish mission was a failure, that they gave up, and now it's all Paul, and it's only Gentiles really is the target audience from then on.
Yeah, that's that's an unfortunate reading that's based on having this wealth of Paul's epistles to the Gentiles. But you've got to get your nose into the book of Hebrews, into the epistle of James, into the epistles of Peter, into the epistle of Jude, and realize there's a whole other world going on here, a whole other world among the work, the work of the rest of the apostles. And it's not as if the other apostles didn't also go to the nations. They later on, after the Pauline mission had launched, the other apostles also started to address the nations more broadly. Once that door was opened, the door was open. It wasn't the sole purview of the Apostle Paul. So we learn a lot. I mean, I'll tell you, finding the history of the apostles takes a lot of detective work. It's because we don't have all these stories in one place. And so where are they coming from? Well, they're coming from a lot of different sources. They're coming from historical sources, like, we can piece things together from the testimony of Josephus, from the writings of Eusebius, the Constantine scribe. He had access to this vast library of early Christian documents. And so he transmits a lot of the early legends of the apostles. We can pick out little pieces here and there, like little anecdotes and such from the early church fathers, from the Ante-Nicene fathers, the apostolic fathers. There's actually quite a wealth of information through that's woven through those texts. And then there's this whole vast body of literature that is called the apocryphal acts of the apostles. And so these are sort of like fan fiction accounts, I guess you might call them. They're like because people felt this. Well, what about the Acts of John? What about the Acts of Philip? What about the Acts of Peter? What about the Acts of Thomas? What about, where's the rest of the story? It means people knew we're missing a lot of the story. And so, writers abhor a vacuum. Yeah. So, writers will write. And so we created these sort of like fictionalized accounts of their lives. But here's the thing with these fictionalized accounts of their lives. The fictionalized accounts of their lives also transmit what was known, what was preserved as an oral tradition or however, within the early communities of these Christian writers. So, for example, if you know if you know as a matter of established tradition, everybody has heard that the Apostle Thomas went to India, right? So then there's got to be some more information around that. So, and you're going to say, you're going to sit down and say, I'm going to write the Acts of Thomas. You're going to collect what and make sure that you represent whatever is already known, whatever is already in circulation, among the believers, among the Christian communities and such, and embellish from there. And that's what we find. So then it becomes this matter of sort of searching for bugs that are fossilized in amber. What you do is you go into these very, very Christian documents that we're talking from the late 2nd century, early 3rd century, that sort of period of time. You go into these very Christian documents and start
Christian
looking
as opposed to like Jewish documents. Like
Right. And you start looking for what sounds suspiciously Jewish in here. Like that there is no way that the Gentile Christian church made this up, because that is straight up Judaism going on. And so you start looking for those and you find them. We find pieces of that all over the place in these otherwise, what are oftentimes absurd tales of the apostles that are almost like on the level of Paul Bunyan type of, and then there's another line of literature that actually comes from one school of early Jewish believers called the Ebionites. And this is the pseudo-Clementine literature. The pseudo-Clementine literature, like Clementine recognitions and Clementine homilies, that is a vast wealth of teaching that was being transmitted. Allegedly, the teaching of Peter, but teaching that was part of the way the early Jewish believers understood the text into the late 2nd century and early 3rd century, and how they were how they were transmitting that teaching. But they also in those documents, you're also getting narrative that's that's kind of framing up that teaching, and some of those narrative elements have to be consistent with what is historically known about that apostle. And that's preserved then within the Jewish community of the early Jewish believers until it finally, takes shape in these written literary works, what are really, fictionalized literary works. So that's sort of the excitement of, putting these back together. Oh, and then there's the martyrologies. We have the martyr stories of the apostles, and we can pick up these pieces here and there from these different martyr stories as they're transmitted to us. You put it all together, and that's what the original project, we originally called it Chronicles of the Apostles, because that's what I was trying to do, was to create a chronicle of the work of not just Paul, but all the apostles, and then to contextualize all of that within the greater Roman world of the time, which we have copious amounts of Roman history, and copious amounts of material from Josephus, that just fill out that world in living color before our eyes if you take the time to study it. And so this is the idea behind the Sent Ones. We're not just doing Acts. We're certainly doing Acts, but we're doing Acts in its bigger world, like Acts, the director's cut of Acts.
Oh yeah,
maybe that's
the Snyder cut of Acts.
Yeah.
Then that's so here's a question that I have, because I grew up Protestant, right? And so I think you grew up Protestant. Yeah,
I totally grew up Protestant. My dad's a Protestant pastor. Yeah.
So like my dad was AOG, and I didn't grow up with a lot of tales of like we would sneer at, right, in my fundamentalist Bible college, we would sneer at these fictionalized accounts, and even like church history to some degree. Anything that looked too Catholic, right? Which starts it starts happening pretty early, and then I started getting into Judaism. And there's tales of the Hasidim, the Baal Shem Tov, and then you go back and there's tales of everybody, right? You open the Talmud, there's wild tales of Old Testament characters, and then the rabbis were getting up to all kinds of stuff, like you said, Paul Bunyan kind of stuff, and this lore, is so fascinating. And then the Catholics have all this the stories of the saints and things. They're still making people saints, and they're saying that there's miracles happening and all this. So there's this whole rich corpus on both sides, the Jewish side and the Catholic side, whereas Whereas, growing up Protestant, I don't feel like I got any of that. Was that at some point, did you sort of feel this lacuna
Yes.
and decide to embark on the journey? How did that happen for you?
Yeah, that's precisely it. That is really well articulated. That's precisely my story as well. I had that experience when my kids were, just children sitting around our Friday night Shabbat table. I wanted to tell them stories. I had all these great collections of Jewish stories of these sages and heroes and, legends legends from the Talmud and such that the Jewish community, Jewish publishers condensed down into children's stories that, can inform kids about the great men of their faith. And so I thought, I need to find some of these about Gentile Christians or even Christian stories, and it's like, let's go to the Christian bookstore. And I thought, I'm going to tell the kids stories of the apostles. I go to the Christian bookstore looking for tales of the apostles and got nothing. I got nothing here. It's like, well, maybe I should have gone to a Catholic bookstore and looked for the Golden Legend or Tales of the Saints or something like that. But that's what alerted me to the realization of wait a second, why don't we know anything about the apostles outside of the book of Acts? Why is this? And I think you're exactly right. I think it was like an allergic reaction to the adoration of the saints that was happening within the Roman tradition, that happens within the Roman tradition. And so the Protestant reflex was to say, okay, we're not interested in anyone but Jesus and Paul.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, we love Paul. I think I remarked to someone at some point, are we Christians or are we like Paulites or something?
Right.
So seems like there's more Paul than Jesus as far as the teachings are.
Oh, so true. Or
at least as far as shaping the theology is concerned.
Yeah. So I started to, this is a long time ago now. This is 30 years ago. But I started to think, well, if no, maybe I'll write stories of the apostles. I'll write stories of the apostles, and that's for my kids. And so that's how I just started reading this kind of literature and just digging and began to realize very quickly there is a great deal of material here that we just don't know. And so I'm really excited with, the Sent Ones to be able to hopefully bring quite a bit of that material. It's not all of it, obviously, we have to pick and choose, but to bring quite a bit of that material into the Torah Club. I think people are going to really enjoy it. I think it's also going to help them contextualize Paul and get their theology straight regarding Paul and his mission to the Gentiles, which is really important, as we've talked about distinction theology on this show before. So this is how you figure that out.
Yeah. Seeing Paul is part of everything else that was going on. Seeing Paul in context as he is talking to Gentiles when he says, "Don't worry about getting circumcised."
Yeah.
And it was confusing back then when he got back to Jerusalem, and the apostles were like, people are saying you're telling Jews not to get circumcised, and he said, "I didn't say that. It's telling Gentiles, Gentiles not to get circumcised." But that's where distinction theology is so important, because most Christians didn't grow up learning that there was even a difference between Jew and Gentile.
Right. I didn't. That was a long time. I was Messianic for a long time before that even began to occur to me, and we've talked about that before, but that's just the natural thing. You think, well, there's no difference. There's no difference. I mean, it says it right in there. There's no difference between slave and free and male and female. There's no difference between men and women. There's no difference between Jew and Gentile, but you just got to think about that for a couple minutes. Slow down, say it again.
Yeah. There's a couple of jokes in there that I won't tell, but I think our listeners can come up with them themselves.
Yeah.
So this is for people who have been in Torah Club for a while. We addressed the neophyte here at the beginning, but some of the people listening to this have been in Torah Club since it started, and they went through a track that took 2 years that we called Jesus, My Rabbi, which is on the same level, just really solid material. The New Testament from a Jewish perspective.
Yeah, the Gospels from a Jewish perspective.
Yeah. The Gospels from a Jewish perspective. It's a harmony of the Gospels, which is useful in itself. But then to see it from a Jewish perspective, changed everything for a lot of people. Finally, a clear vision of Rabbi Yeshua. He's a rabbi. He's not just prophet, priest, and king. He is all those things, but he's also a rabbi. And that was the hat that he was wearing for so much of what he did in the Gospels, and we just don't see it unless we understand that's what he was doing. Now, can I assume the sent ones is going to blow people's minds the same way with Acts, right? There's passages in Acts where you're going to lead some horses to water here, and we're gonna be able to drink up some perspectives that we never would have considered, right? In Acts,
yeah.
Can you give us a preview of maybe some Bible verses that are finally going to come to life here in Acts?
Well, okay. I mean, yes, I'm going to answer your question and say, yes, I think this is going to happen in every single lesson that you're going to say, wow, I never saw that before. I've read that 100 times and I never realized what was going on there. And that's just because we're providing context. We're providing the Jewish context and such. But yeah, there's some really significant stuff, obviously. So for example, I mean, some of the big things that you're going to be dealing with, I'm thinking like right off the bat, we're coming into the question of what is this speaking in tongues business?
Oh yeah.
What's going on here? I mean, this is a question that the church has to today, and continues to vex people. So we're going to address that. We're going to address that from a Jewish perspective, and just understand tongues as, what would this mean in terms of Jewish phenomenon? How about when we get over to Acts chapter 10 and we're dealing with that Peter's vision of the sheet, that sheet coming down from heaven. Get up, Peter, kill and eat, there's all sorts of unclean animals in here. This has implications or ramifications for how we've understood the Christian diet for 2,000 years.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, that's going to turn over the proverbial table. Little jest. And then there's, I suppose when we get into Acts 15, again, what are these four apostolic decrees that, we get there to tell the Gentiles, it's okay. You don't have to be Jewish, or keep the Torah as long as you don't, eat things that are sacrificed to idols or blood or, and of course, sexual immorality. You want to stay away from that. And the meat of strangled animals, because that's gross. What's going on here? Well, there's a whole Jewish context here, and there's an explanation here. So all of these, and I don't want to get into any one particular thing in the details right now, because it would take the rest of the episode of the podcast to unwrap all those sorts of things.
Fair.
And that happens over and over and over again, where it's like you have the conventional interpretation that has sort of ruled the narrative, or how we understand the narrative, how we interpret the narrative for most of Christian history. But when you put it back into its natural habitat, which is Judaism, it just puts it in a different light, and you realize, oh, okay, wait, if that's this, then this must be that. And so, I mean, I'm being vague.
Yeah. Well, you sign up, everybody.
Sign up. I guess
TorahClub.org.
There you go. That's the thing. There's a teaser. These are teasers.
Yeah. I just think it's fascinating. Just thinking about what you said a little bit ago about how you can sift through early Christian literature looking for stuff that's Jewish. Like, we talk about the divorce between Judaism and Christianity, right? And actually the Sent Ones gets into a lot of that is in the content. And we talk about it like it's this great tragedy, and it is. It's not like it was not the apostolic vision to have Gentiles go off and start their own religion based on a misreading of the teachings of Paul. But it has provided, I mean, everything happens because Hashem is part of Hashem's plan, right? And
God knows what he's doing. Yeah.
Yeah. To see that now we can go suss out what is authentic. We can suss out what dates back to the earliest, those formative years of the church by looking for those things that are Jewish. That wouldn't have happened any other way.
Right.
It's like doing archaeology. You find a fossil that is or whatever. I mean, maybe that's a controversial idea.
No, I feel that's exactly how I feel about it. Is like it's like doing archaeology, and then, I mean, you're doing archaeology, you find a piece of pottery, and that particular shape of that pottery, an archaeologist will be able to identify the era at which the pottery was looking like that. Potters were doing this particular lip on a jar only from within this span of time, and they can narrow that down to like astonishing accuracy and get that within like 50 years or 100 years. And you're talking like there's 2,000 years of archaeology here, but you hit this layer and it's like, okay, here, look, this is Iron Age. This is from the days of King David and King Saul, something like that. That's amazing, how they do that. Well, I feel like we're doing that with the literature as well. And, because you say, okay, well, this is Jewish. This is authentically Jewish. Then you've hit some pay dirt.
Yeah. Because it changed so quickly.
It did. It really, really did.
You're in the 2nd century and it's all gone.
I think that's really probably what we need to say here when we're talking about the sent ones. It's really, the whole thing is trying to answer the question of why did it change so quickly? What happened? How did we go from this Jewish sect of Yeshua followers, with Gentiles coming into this Jewish sect of Yeshua followers, and the situation that we see in the book of Acts, that's depicted so clearly in the book of Acts? How do we go from that to, in the 2nd century, we go into the church age so quickly, where it's like we're eschewing Judaism, and Judaism has become the negative other in all of the way that church writers are speaking about themselves and identifying themselves theologically and socially and culturally. It's really astonishing, the transformations. And so I guess that was sort of part of the big detective story. It wasn't just to find missing stories of the apostles. It was to find out what happened here. So you could look at it that way. And because that is one of the primary focuses of this year of study.
Nice. So, maybe for some of the more type A people out there, for me, just studying the Bible, sort of for its own sake, that's something I could just do for the rest of my life. Maybe someone out there is looking, is thinking more practically, and they're looking for something that they can take out into the world. They're asking for the practical upshot. So, let me ask this question from my personal experience. So, when I was in this fundamentalist Bible college down in the Florida Panhandle, some of you guys know what it is. One of the teachers said, and I remember this word for word. He said, "Experience the teachings of the apostles." It was a class on Acts. He said, "Experience the teachings of the apostles. Do not teach the experiences of the apostles." In other words, nothing that happens in the book of Acts, according to this guy, is there to set an example for how we should do anything. And what he was talking about, I think, is like speaking in tongues. Like we mentioned, the tongues of fire come and everyone's hearing in their own language. The fundamentalists, at least at that time, I don't know if they're on the same page now, but they had a lot to say about how this doesn't happen now. They're big cessationists, right? So there's no miracles happening. There's not even miraculous gifts of the Spirit. And so they look at Acts. It's a real problem for them because otherwise they would very much say that they want to live to do early church, that's when it was pure and good, and then the Catholics came and defiled everything or whatever. But in Acts, it was like they had so many analogies and metaphors. That was the booster rocket that sent the spaceship into space, and we don't need it anymore. Jettison the booster.
Oh my goodness!
Back down to Earth, and you just you read it, it's inspired, but you can't do any of this stuff. Don't try to do any of this stuff.
Oh,
we've touched on this when we say that. Well, one thing that you shouldn't do is try to be an apostle of Yeshua, because that was a limited time offer, right?
Right.
But
Right.
on the other hand, it seems like going too far to say that none of it is useful. So I sort of thought I would poke your brain a little bit here. For those out there who are maybe struggling with what can I take away from Acts and just into my life and do right now, is the sent one's going to help clarify it, like from a discipleship or devotional perspective, what we can glean from Acts for what it means to live a life of faith as a Gentile follower of Jesus today.
Yeah, those are good questions, and there's actually a lot there. So first of all, I think it's worth just stating for the record that we are not cessationists whatsoever. We're not cessationists, but we do acknowledge that the apostles themselves, they were in a special class. They absolutely. I mean, Paul says that clearly himself. He says, the signs and miracles that indicate an apostle, so they had a special set of bells and whistles. There's no question about that. But the endowment of the Holy Spirit was not limited to the apostles. The endowment of the Holy Spirit is something that was just the apostles just assumed that's what happens when you become a disciple of Yeshua of Nazareth. You become part of his body and you receive the Holy Spirit. And so you should expect to live a supernatural life from then on. You're going to have these supernatural experiences and there's these gifts and so forth. So we're not cessationists. And in that regard, the stories should be inspiring to us today. It's not just a booster rocket or something like that to get you into the atmosphere, whatever that metaphor was. Instead, God is still very much at work, just as he was in the apostolic age. And like our master said, greater things than these you will do. So I want to encourage people in that regard. But let's consider your question from a Jewish perspective. From a Jewish perspective, discipleship is always about emulating the righteous, the acts of the righteous, the deeds of the righteous. How do you become righteous? The sages say, if you want to be righteous, hang around with righteous people. So you learn righteousness through imitation of behavior. So we want to internalize the heart and the attitude and the actions and the passions even of the apostles, because they were the ones who were actually designated by our master Yeshua to transmit this faith to us, to transmit these kingdom values to us, and to transmit the message to us. And so they're the ones who are living out the implications of what it is to be a follower of Yeshua of Nazareth. So they are models for us. They're setting the standard for what all disciples of Yeshua should be doing. No, we're not on the level of apostles, but we're all disciples. And that counts for something. That counts for a lot. And so discipleship, by its very definition, is a matter of learning, memorization of your teacher's words, and imitation of your teacher. And so if we're disciples of the apostles, which we are, disciples of Yeshua first and foremost, of course, but by extension of his apostles, then it's all valuable. Every piece of it is valuable to us.
Yeah, I was having lunch with a guy. I hope he's not listening to this. I was having lunch with a guy years and years ago, a local pastor, and we were having this conversation. I think I might have even said this on the podcast before, but he was trying to tell me, like I was telling him the apostles kept doing Judaism, and he's like, well, yeah, but they missed the boat. They weren't supposed to do that. They got confused. And only Paul got it right. And I just remember thinking, like, wow, if that's your perspective, you're missing a pretty critical link in the chain there.
Yeah.
Like, how are you cool with Jesus if you're not cool with the apostles? Everything we know about Jesus came through these guys, and you're saying that they didn't get it.
Yeah, such an amazing perspective. I heard that from a Lutheran pastor one time. He had the same conversation. He told me, I was making the argument, look, the apostles are doing Judaism. And he said to me, yes, it's true. They were still holding on to their Judaism. And that is why God had to raise up Paul to correct them. So I said to him, so the guys that Yeshua himself was teaching, that was a fail. It's like, yeah. So Yeshua failed in his 3 years of trying to educate these guys. Like, okay, we need to start from scratch here. Let's just go get this Pharisee over here. And this, yeah, real sad perspective. Really unfortunate.
Yeah. All right. So These are the reasons are racking up that someone might want to go to torahclub.org, sign up for the sent ones, get this perspective, get everything straightened out.
Yeah.
You mentioned that one of the first things you said here on this podcast episode is that it's acts and beyond. So I thought I would ask, how far beyond? When does the ship dock here at the end of the 52 weeks of study?
Yeah, great question. Okay, so the first thing is that it takes us beyond the lives of the apostles into, or what we know of the lives of the apostles, into the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of Jerusalem, the war with Rome, the Jewish revolt, which is a major part of the gospel story, even though it's not included in the gospels because the gospels ostensibly are written before this. I mean, all the events in the gospels happen before the fall of Jerusalem, obviously. Nevertheless, that's the primary thrust and message of the gospel of the kingdom. Repent because the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And if you don't repent, then there's this doom that's coming, that's hanging over the people. And so we get to see this conclusion of the master's predictions, which was so central to his core message. And we live through that. We're going to live through that in the sent ones, because we have an eyewitness account to all of it in the person of, Josephus, the Jewish historian, who was actually present at the siege of Jerusalem. He was a rebel in the Galilee. He was the general leading the Galilee against Rome, and then was captured, and then was also present in the Flavian household, became a scribe and a historian in the Flavian household. So we have this first person perspective to unwrap and to look at. So that's a huge part of the apostolic story, the story of the first century believers. Absolutely enormous, including the flight to Pella that Eusebius tells us about. And so we're going to get into all of that. And we actually have a great deal of information through those troubled years. But then we keep going. We just keep going, because then we're going to move on into the Bar Kokhba revolt and the implications of the Bar Kokhba revolt, which we're up in 135 Common Era for the Bar Kokhba revolt. And that's in the time period of, we've had Ignatius by then. And so we have to deal with him and figure out, okay, what's making this guy tick? And then we've got Justin Martyr, who's writing about then. And then there's the heretic Marcion, who has emerged. He's emerging around that period of time. And that brings us into people like Irenaeus, his teachings, and the Roman persecutions that he's seeing, and so forth. So yeah, we've got that's about where it cuts off. I'm going to say we're probably up around 150 Common Era, where we're going to end the chronicle there. And the reason is that the apostolic era really comes to an end around the era of Trajan, when John the Apostle dies. It continues a little bit further with some of the disciples in Jerusalem that are still holding on to their identity after the fall of Jerusalem. But that comes to an end with the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135, like I mentioned. And so that's where I would put the end of the apostolic era. And so then it's just a little bit of wrapping up action after that. Brings us up to about 150, about the middle of the 2nd century.
So you mentioned some of the major players that emerge, because for me, I never got super into patristics again, because the fundamentalist education,
Right.
These guys are, they don't particularly, their insights are not particularly valued, at least in the communities that I sojourned in, right?
Right.
So the limited contact that I've had with them, because I just have a lot to do, is there's Clement, who seems like a good guy. I read Clement and I think, yeah,
Oh, right on. Yep.
he seems solid.
Yep.
Then you get to the 2nd century. You get to, like you mentioned, Justin Martyr or Ignatius, and they're writing these screeds about the Jews are not just that God is not working through the Jewish people anymore, but it's like that they're uniquely bad.
Yep.
That they're not only are they not God's people, they're almost as far away from that as you can get. They're like the opposite. Uniquely cursed or children of Satan sort of things. You go to Chrysostom's a little later. He dials it up, but you don't have to go that far forward from Acts to start finding these guys that really are anti-Judaism, and it sounds to my ear pretty anti-Jewish.
Yeah, it falls apart pretty quickly. And that's the question that I'm saying. Like, how do we get from Clement, who you mentioned, Clement, the disciple of Peter, is in Rome writing to the Corinthians, extremely Jewish work. This is like no problems here. This could have been in the New Testament. In fact, Clement is sort of like, it got left out of the New Testament, not because there was anything theologically objectionable in Clement, but rather because it was obvious that he was not an eyewitness. He's not an apostle. Instead, he's the disciple of an apostle. He's the disciple of Peter. He's a disciple of Paul. So Clement, he's a footnote in that regard. He should be, if the New Testament had an appendix, Clement would go in there.
For sure.
So, but how do we get from Clement to Ignatius?
Because Ignatius was a disciple of Polycarp, right? Is that right?
Well, you know what? I'm not going to give him that cred. I think Ignatius knew Polycarp.
Oh, okay.
But I don't know that that claim that he was a disciple of Polycarp is.
That's what I had heard.
Yes, I've heard that too.
That would only put him 2 generations removed.
He is early
from the Apostle John.
Yeah, that's correct. He is. So he's early like that. He's early. He comes out of Antioch, though. Polycarp is not out of Antioch. So, that's another. We'll meet all these characters in the Sent Ones. You'll meet all of these characters, and you'll get to know all of these characters and their stories, and you'll see that transition happen. It's really it's enlightening in that regard. These will no longer just be names to you. You'll know their stories. You'll know something about them, and you'll know the geography.
Oh yeah.
There's a whole geography component to this Bible study.
We're giving people something to help with that, aren't we?
Right,
there's a pamphlet or a maps and things.
No, it's a full on. It's an extra purchase, but it's a set of maps that my brother put together, a geography marking booklet. So you would be working with your highlighters and such to follow the apostles as they bring the gospel around the world. You will learn the geography of the Roman world, into Parthia, into India. When you follow Thomas out into India, you'll learn. You'll be down in Egypt. You'll be marking Alexandria, and so you will learn the geography of the Roman era world as the apostles are traipsing all over, bringing the gospel to the 4 corners of the earth. If you do the geography component, so I recommend the geography component because it's another way to help organize the information spatially in your mind. And so I always think it's best to study the Bible with a map next to you.
It makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Otherwise, it could be hard to visualize what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I think the last question I have is, we might have already answered, but if someone out there is still on the fence and they just want to know, okay, what am I? Why should I sign up for this? What am I going to take away from this versus all the other Bible studies I could be doing? What am I going to get here that I couldn't get anywhere else?
Okay, that's a great question. And what I'm going to offer you is you're going to get from this Bible study a way to contextualize, read, understand, and interpret the entire New Testament. It's going to give you, so it's not just Acts. You're not just learning Acts. Instead, you're going to be learning where all the different epistles that constitute the New Testament fit into the story, to whom they were written, what their issues were, why those epistles were written, what's going on in the background, what tensions and such. And so when you come to Philippians or you come to Ephesians, you're going to know where that was going, to whom it was addressed. When you read First Peter, you're going to feel the tension that's building, behind the scenes that Peter's writing, or when James is saying, "Count it all joy, my friends, when you face various kinds of sufferings and trials." You're going to know what those sufferings and trials are to which he's referring. So it's going to give you this bird's eye view of the New Testament, and even the Gospels. You'll realize, oh, this is where the Gospels started to be written. This is why they were written. This is So all of this comes together in this overarching study. Which organizes the material. So rather than just a book of just flipping through another book of the Bible, holy book, holy words, go find something inspiring. Maybe here's a devotional thought. Oh, that kind of, instead, you'll see the whole sweep of it. So it's like, they call in the marketing for this, we, for when we first created Chronicles of the Apostles, we used to refer to, the Gospels you've heard as the greatest story ever told. I like to say this is the sequel to the greatest story ever told. This is the sent ones. This is the Chronicles, the lives of the apostles, the sequel to the greatest story ever told. And it's also the greatest story ever told.
Nice. Well, I'm looking forward to it. We got a Torah Club here in Michigan, and we're going to be going through it. And, for all of you out there, just go have a look. Go to torahclub.org. Go look. Go find a club. Find a club that's close enough to you that you could go. And if there isn't one, we have online options, but try to find one that's close enough that you can drive to it. There's a lot of great, we've talked about content, but Torah Club's great, man. You make friends, you have conversations, you meet people, maybe, meet somebody. Yeah. There's a lot of reasons to go to a Torah Club.
Yep. Make some friends.
Yeah, get out, go make some friends. It's so important. We have people in our Torah Club. Maybe you're listening to this and you think, oh, I disagree with some of that. We have people in our Torah Club who disagree, and they, every week we have conversations, and it's just to get out there and sharpen yourself against some other disciples. It's good. It's good. So, like Andy Stanley says, circles, not rows. Get into a circle in Torah Club with some disciples.
There you go. Yep, that's good.
All right. Well, thanks, Dan, again for joining us on this episode of the podcast. It's always a joy to have you on here because you know so much and you're so good at explaining things.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity. I always like hanging out with you, Jacob. So it's always fun.
Thanks for joining us today on Messiah Podcast. If you're interested in learning more about the Jewish Jesus, check out First Fruits of Zion at ffoz.org. And if you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you're listening. Messiah Podcast is made possible by the generosity of our First Fruits of Zion friends. FFOZ friends are people like you who support our mission and get loads of exclusive Bible commentary, teaching, and content. You can join today at ffoz.org. Tune in next time for more great conversations. Until then, I'm Jacob Franzak. Shalom.
Let his word cover you and me, like the waters cover the sea. Let his love cover you and me, like the waters cover the sea.